Showtime, huh? Welcome to Reading in the Dark. I'm storyteller Rich Knoblich. I live here in Wheeling. Currently, I'm employed as the storyteller up at Ogilvy. I know a lot of people think I didn't Ogilvy had a storyteller. Neither do they. My current assignment is at the Welcome Center. If I share duties with others, if you happen to come in and ask, I'll gladly tell you historic tales and tall tales of Ogilvy. Humor is my specialty. I brought home 8 ribbons from the State Liars Contest. If you would like to find out about those tales and read them yourself, you can do so at weelunk.com, WEELUNK.com. And type in my name and you'll be able to find a variety. I have to tell you, they're tall tales, steeped in humor. And about 6 months ago, the fine folks at Wheeling sent me a notice and said, we're going to put a disclaimer on your stories. They got tired of people calling and saying, where did this happen? When did this happen? And there was a historian from Ohio, whose specialty was National Road, and she happened to come across my story on the Wheeling Suspension Bridge. And she wanted me to cite my material. What were my sources? I don't have any. I told her it's pure imagination. Tall tale. She said, oh man, you had me hook, line, and sinker. So about 2 weeks later, she calls back. She said, I'm doing this book on the bridges, National Road. Can I include your story? This stuff is so dry, it could really use a pick-me-up. So I said, you can write it. Tonight, a rather gruesome tale. I don't know. It's one of those stories, Bluebeard, that I have avoided. I remember first reading it as a kid in a book. And, pretty darn brilliant. Couldn't believe I was reading this. And years later, I sit there, and of course, I tell all kinds of folk tales, some fairy tales, mostly my own original work. And so when they contacted me to come and tell this, they gave me a choice of 2 stories, one I'd never heard of, and then Bluebeard. Okay, I'm familiar with Bluebeard. Don't see a whole lot of humor in it, but I managed to muddle through. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman, and he had a blue beard. Nobody knows if it was genetic or if he had had an evil curse put upon him. Nowadays, if you tell children about a man with a blue beard, they say, oh, cool! Whoa. But nowadays, it's very common. You see hair streaked with blue, sometimes with red. St. Patrick's Day is coming. And in this story, because of his blue beard, nobody questions, why did he just shave it off? Kids today will find out. Well, he was probably cursed, or he was the curse. Anyway, it was so frightful that people kind of avoided him. I don't know if he had any friends and whether they called him Blue. Yo, Blue, how you doing? Don't know if people that dealt with him called him Mr. Beard. But according to the story, he was known as Bluebeard. He was very wealthy, extremely wealthy. Let's call him an oligarch nowadays. In the same town where he had a fine, fine house, there was a lady with 2 young daughters, and they were quite beautiful, and they were of marrying age. Naturally, she wanted them to marry only the finest and the best men in the area. How to get her introduced to all the fine men, so she decided she would have a tea party and have her friends bring their daughters, and they would invite all the eligible men in town. Well, that included, of course, Bluebeard. Fabulously wealthy. Don't want to ignore that. Although he was known to have had several wives before. Nobody knows whatever happened to them. It was assumed they finally got fed up with the Bluebeard and his atrocious looks with the Bluebeard, took their share of the money and left, so as not to be bothered. They didn't have prenuptials in those days. Well, the lady had a fine tea. It was lovely. It was in the garden, the best china. Everyone went home later that afternoon. And Bluebeard was quite smitten with her 2 daughters. And he asked if he could court them. And the way he decided to do this is he would return the favor by asking the mother, the 2 daughters, and say 3 or 4 of their friends, take them out to his country estate. Fine estate it was. Spend a few days, get to know each other. Well, they all agreed. When the time came, he sent some fine carriages, beautiful prancing horses, picked them up to town, drove them out to the estate. Oh, they had a wonderful time. They stayed for several days. There were a wide variety of rooms. He'd take them on a tour of the house. Each room more opulent than the one before. And they passed the time away getting to know each other through horseback riding, fox hunting, archery. They played indoor games that were popular at the time, like charade, Monopoly, Wordle. Well, after a few days, the party was over. Everybody went back home. He was a very, very gracious man. And the young daughter sat there and thought and told her older sister, he said, I do believe I can overlook that Bluebeard. He was gracious, he had fine food, and let's face it, the man was loaded. He had everything. What a wonderful life that would be. What a great experience. So she started to date him, and presently they were engaged, and then it was a magnificent wedding. And then they went to live out in the country estate. They had been out there, couldn't have been more than, say, about a week, and he called her into his office, said, I need for you to understand that I got word of a business problem, and I will be gone, I'm guessing, about 2 weeks. The letter just came today, and I've already ordered them to pack up my traveling belongings. But I need for you to take care of the estate. With that, he laid down a large ring with dozens of keys on it. He said, these keys can get you wherever you need to go throughout the estate. Take this key. He pushed it around the ring. This takes care of my boxes of gold. Oh, it's a delight to just lift them up and let them jingle, jangle. This key here, these are for the boxes of silver. Oh, the silver is so beautiful to look at, to touch. This key here, this takes care of my box of Bitcoin. And he went through, he told what each of the keys were. So he got to the very last one. It was a bit smaller than the others. Wasn't quite as ornate. This key, he said, this key you are to never use. At the end of the long hallway on the first floor, there's a door. This key goes to that door. You're never, ever to open that. To which she replied, okay. If you were to open that door, I will come down with a wrath that you didn't know existed. Okay. So when he decided he had impressed it upon her, he shoved the ring over and said, all right, take care. Why don't you invite a few of your friends out? You can all make merry, have a good time. You won't be so lonely out here. Okay. Well, he went out and got to his carriage late evening. When the carriage went through the town and people saw the magnificent carriage heading on out and going into the far country, oh, they didn't wait to get invited. They got their buggies and horses and they went straight on out. Oh, they couldn't wait to really explore this place. Well, she was delighted to see all her friends coming. And they would open one drawer after another and just, oh my gosh, look at this silverware. Oh my gosh, look at that. They go upstairs and there'd be a drawer with nothing but tiaras and diamonds, necklaces. And they close it. So they were rummaging all through that house, just amazed at what they saw and all the treasures he had stored away. Now, Mrs. Bluebeard, you know, it just kept eating away at her. That key. That key. So never go in. Well, maybe I won't go in. Maybe I'll just unlock the door and gaze. So, while all her companions were preoccupied with looking about the house and enjoying themselves, she took the key off the ring, left the ring in her bedchamber, went on down to the back stairway, and there was the door. And she reached out and turned the key, click, click, and opened the door. I wish somebody would buy Storyteller some oil for those hinges. Every door squeaks. I don't know what the problem is. Well, she really couldn't see from the threshold, so she did step in. Just a step or two. Didn't really go in. Just a step or two. The room was kind of dark. The shutters on the window had been closed, but as she sat there blinking, her eyes grew accustomed to the dimness. That's when she realized there were dead bodies. Several dead bodies. They were all women. A couple of them from the village she recognized, who had married Bluebeard. Their throats had been slashed, they had been mutilated, they were propped up against the wall. There on the table, blood splattered, tools that he used, knives and such. The floor was covered with blood. He made no attempt to clean up after himself. This was no Dexter. That's when he suddenly realized she had married a serial killer. Well, she started to back up. She was trembling so badly, she dropped that key and landed in a small pool of blood. Pulled out one of her hankies, or handkerchief, whatever you care. Reached down, picked it up, wrapped it up, wiped it off, stepped back, closed the door, locked the door, click, click. And with trembling hands, she ran straight up to her bed chambers. There she went in, turned on the water, started washing. Yeah, he had running water, that's how rich he was. They don't have that in many stories. She tried to scrub that. She used soap. She even went over to the writing desk where they had a bit of sand with ink, and she put that on. And with the soap, she scrubbed and she scoured. She even tried banana. Bartender's helper. Nothing worked. She'd scrub it on one side. She finally got it off. She'd flip it over, and the blood had soaked through that magic key to the other side. Well, she didn't know what she was going to do. Oh my gosh. But she went, she hid that key away, and wouldn't you know, just at that time, she heard a clattering of hoofbeats out in the courtyard. Looking out the window, she saw that her husband had returned much sooner than expected. Well, she went downstairs and all her friends saw that Bluebeard had returned. They suddenly lost their nerve. They started heading out to their own horses and carriages. As they passed the bot, oh, time to leave. Where has the time gone? Sorry, we can't stay. Bye. They all took off, except for Sister Ann. Sister Ann had stayed. She had decided to set herself into the bedroom next to Mrs. Bluebeard's bedchamber. And they could get together and have one of those nice sister talks. Long strolls in the gardens, chit-chat. Sure, she wouldn't know how he was in bed. So it was that Sister Ann was there. Well, Bluebeard came in. Mrs. Bluebeard, she feigned, oh, delight, surprise, oh, you're home already. And she could have won an Oscar with this performance. I didn't expect you back so soon. Oh, wow. This is as I was headed towards the town where the problem was. A messenger on horseback came out and handed me a letter. He told me everything had been resolved in my favor. A letter. Not a tweet. Not an email. A letter. So he promptly turned around, came on home. Well, I'm delighted you're back, she said. Had a long day. I think I'll go up to my chambers and go to bed now. Next day, early in the morning, Bluebeard called for her into his office. He said, I hope you enjoyed yourself with your friends. Yes, I did. Yeah. Well, I need for you to bring me back my ring of keys. Oh, the keys. Yes, they're upstairs. Let me go get those. She went upstairs, and she came back down, and her hand was a bit shaky, and she handed them over. Yes, went to the library, here's the den, here's where we keep the furs. Went through, and said, oh, well, everything seems to be very well, my dear. Except the one key. The one key to the door at the end of the hall. I do not see it here. Oh, that. Oh, yeah. Well, since I wasn't allowed to use it, I took it off and I left it upstairs. Someplace up there. Go get it. Well, I'll get it. Go get it. She went up the stairs. She knocked on Sister Ann's door. She quickly related all that had happened and how he wanted the key back. You got to stall for time somehow. Okay. Do something. So she went back downstairs, and Bluebeard saw her going by in the hallway. Wife, come in. Oh, yes, husband. What is it you want? The key. Oh, the key. You know, it's one of those things where you walk into a room and you say to yourself, now, why did I walk in here? Completely forgot. Oh, well, let's have the key now. So she left, she went up, she brought the key down, she trembled. Here you go. And she put it on the key ring and jangled the keys up and said, yes, okay, thank you. And we started pushing through the keys until he came. Wife, why is there blood on this key? There's no blood. Yes, there is. No, there isn't. Yes, there is. There isn't. Yes, there is. There isn't. I see blood. You've been in that room. No, I wasn't. Yes, you were. No, I wasn't. Yes, you were. I told you you would meet my wrath. With that, he pulled out a saber, grabbed her by her long hair. You shall now meet the fate that all the others did. She pleaded and she begged. She cried. She said, please give me time to say my prayers so that I may enter heaven. All right. I'll give you half an hour. With that trembling and crying and wiping tears from her eyes, she went up the stairs and told her sister that he discovered about the key. He was down there and he was preparing to kill. Is there any way out? Sister Ann said, okay. I invited the two brothers, our two brothers. Surely they should be here by now, I can think. Do this. Take those stairs up to the high tower, look out the window, see if you can see them coming. I'm sure we can stall for time until they get here and rescue us. So Sister Ann climbed the spiral stairs into the tall turret and out the window. Mrs. Bluebeard called out, Sister Ann, do you see anything? Just the wind blowing the rain and the sun shining. She paced back and forth, just terrified of the fate. Is you done? Are you done yet? Said Bluebeard. No, I have more time. And then over to the stairs. Called up the turret. Sister Ann, do you see anything? Yes, I see a cloud of dust on the road. A cloud of... No, it's just the circus came to town. Never mind. She paced back and forth and back and forth. Bluebeard called up, your time's almost done. Come down. I still have time, she shouted. Sister Ann, do you see anything? Yes, I see a cloud of dust on the road, and it's headed this way. I'm waving my scarf frantically to let them know as a signal something's not right. They're coming closer. Wait, it's not two men on steeds. It's an Uber. She waved it, and you could see the car was coming faster and faster. And so Bluebeard shouted one more time, come down now. Your time is up. Come down now, or I shall come up and drag you down. I'm coming. She walked very, very slowly. Very, very slowly. Oh, so slowly. She got down there. Bluebeard grabbed her by the hair, flung her to the floor, raised his saber, but then they could hear the Uber horn. And in through the door burst her two brothers. One was a dragoon, the other was a musketeer. Allow me to interpret that in modern terms for you. One was a Navy SEAL, one was a Green Beret. Immediately, Bluebeard realized they're going to kill him. And he had no chance against these men in the combat. And he turned and fled out the back door. They chased after him through the back door with the old screen door squeaking open. Somebody get some oil, clang. Well, they caught him before he got out of the car. They drew their swords and they ran it through him, killing him there on the spot. In inquiring his health, the grand jury refused to indict either brother. Since there was no heirs, Mrs. Bluebeard, she reverted back to her maiden name later, inherited everything. She had all the gold, the silver, the diamonds, the estate, the manor house. With part of it, she was able to endow her sister. She was able to buy her two brothers. Since she had so much wealth, they formed a company, seats on the stock exchange. As for Bluebeard's body, they decided the best thing to do was cremate it. And they thought only a devil deserves the flame. As for those poor dead girls, the priest was brought in. That entire end of the building was dismantled. The stone walls were made into headstones. They were given their own place in the cemetery. The leftover stone was used to make a chapel. The priest came and said prayers, and all the mourners wished them well to heaven. As for Mrs. Bluebeard, she changed her name back to her own name. She lived for quite a few years. Once again, she found true love, although people use the word cougar with her once in a while, and her husband. But she lived happily ever after. That, my friends, is the story of Bluebeard. I thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much. You're good.
Okay.
So while I'm getting ready to go, you have paper in front of you. And what I would like you to do is, well, let me take a step back. So a lot of fairy tales that have violence in them, like this one that we heard today, would have a moral at the end of them, or like a lesson, right? So what I want you to do on your paper is write down what you think the moral or lesson of this story is. Doesn't have to be long. Usually the morals are like a sentence. So what do you think the moral or the lesson of this story is?
Well, that's okay. I looked it up.
You looked it up?
Because I thought, I wonder what the lesson here is. I realized it's pretty convoluted.
Yeah.
Like several.
Well, they could be there could be more than one moral.
Yeah.
Let's say that, okay?
The one you're gonna tell?
I'm not telling a story. I'm gonna do more of like a presentation on the moral
Of this story?
the moral of his story.
Oh, okay.
So what was the moral of Bluebeard? And as you're thinking about that, so a lot of these tales operate on what scholars call a pedagogy of fear. Pedagogy is an important term in this. Does anybody know what it means?
Yeah, teaching life, inducing fear.
It's a teaching method, right? So it's like a way by which someone is teaching someone else something. So, if we think of fairy tales, for example, as a teaching tool for children, many people have argued that they operate on a pedagogy of fear by making children afraid of things. So, all that said, write your moral down, and then I'm going to get started. Do we have some? Maybe. Okay. We'll come back to this later, so keep it in front of you. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm Dr. McCort from Point Park University, which is right down in the middle of Pittsburgh, but I live in Washington, PA, which is, an easy commute from here. What I'm going to talk about today is not only the older fairy tales, but also some newer fairy tale novels that have been written for children that make use of a lot of the pedagogy that is in the older fairy tales. So I'm going to start off with my own story. And as I'm talking, I'm going to have up on the slides some images that are going to help you envision what I'm speaking about. All right, here we go. Imagine this scenario. You walk into a decrepit, deserted house, moving cautiously through an empty kitchen, a dirty bathroom with a dead spider the size of a small cat in the tub, and down a desolate hallway. You enter what used to be a bedroom with a large metal ring in the center of the floor. You realize grimly that this ring opens a trap door. We're back to doors again, right? A door that you have to open to discover what's inside. Terribly, slowly, stiffly, heavily, the trapdoor lifts to reveal a set of stairs leading down into utter darkness. And terribly slowly, you make your way down those stairs into the darkness and the stench, which smells of damp soil and rotting bread dough. You feel along the walls and find a light switch, which turns on a naked bulb that sways dimly from the ceiling, revealing crude drawings of eyes on the peeling walls, cardboard boxes filled with molding newspapers, and a pile of curtains with a foot protruding from underneath. You pull back the curtains, and there on the floor is a bloated, swollen doppelganger of your father. Do we know what doppelganger means? It's your double, right? And usually they're like an evil double, if you have a doppelganger too. The thing turns its head to look at you, and its mouth opens in the mouthless face, strands of pale stuff sticking to the lips. These are quotes from the story. And in a voice that no longer even faintly resembles your father, it whispers your name. After a few painful moments in which you discover that this version of your father now stands between you and the cellar stairs, between you and escape, the white and huge and swollen thing lunges across the cellar towards you, quote, its toothless mouth open wide. You swiftly realize that you're left with two choices, quote, scream and try to run away and be chased around the badly lit cellar by the huge grub thing, end quote, until it catches you and devours you, or draw on your own resources and, quote, do something else. This seems like a lovely scene right out of the pages of your favorite children's book, right? Though it seems to be drawn more from the latest horror flick haunting the scenes or the screens at the local cinema. The scene, in fact, comes from the popular children's book Coraline, written by Neil Gaiman and published in 2002. This book, chock full of props from the horror genre, is not an anomaly in the world of children's literature either. In many of the world's most popular and well-known children's tales, especially fairy tales, terrifying characters like Mr. Bluebeard that we just heard about often rear their ugly heads. From the child-devouring witch in Hansel and Gretel, to the biting, snatching Jabberwock in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, to R.L. Stine's Goosebumps series, Gothic and horror elements are everywhere in the child's literary world. Let's consider the fairy tales written by the Grimm brothers and Charles Perrault, for instance, in which horrific elements are central to many of the stories. Little Snow White's stepmother wants to consume the heart or the lungs, depending on the version of the story that you read, of her innocent stepdaughter for dinner. Little Red Riding Hood is devoured by a wolf for straying too far from the path, and then must be cut from his stomach by the huntsman, a popular character in the fairy tale. A young girl watches another girl be chopped to pieces as she is prepared to be eaten. Bluebeard's dead wives are ranged along the walls of his secret chamber, their throats slit and their voices forever silenced. Perhaps these elements do not seem so terrifying to us any longer because we've become so used to them over time. They've become like a really recognizable thread in the cultural cloth, and we're no longer cut by them. But if we really think about these things happening in reality, happening to us and not just the young girls in the pictures, the gruesomeness of the scenarios is almost overwhelming. Imagine yourself in the belly of the wolf or happening upon Bluebeard's wives' bodies, their blood congealing on the floor. As Anna Jackson, Karen Coates, and Roderick McGillis note in their introduction to the book, The Gothic in Children's Literature Haunting the Borders, children, quote, have always had a predilection for what we now categorize as the Gothic, for ghosts and goblins, haunting and horrors, fear and the pretense of fear, end quote. The most popular children's books over the last 30-odd years depend heavily on the Gothic tradition and the conventions of dark fantasy. Harry Potter and his friends continue to fly their broomsticks off the shelves. The vampire duo of Edward and Bella racked up billions of dollars in both film and book form, and the vastly popular Hunger Games trilogy made the entire world a haunted house. R.L. Stine's books, for example, have come under fire ever since their inception for rotting the brains of young readers. One scholar in his essay on Stine's appeal said, in describing the problem some adults have with the Goosebumps stories, quote, when R.L. Stine's Goosebumps books first appeared only a few years ago, many parents, teachers, and librarians viewed the mere existence of the new series as a monstrous intrusion into the well-intentioned world of children's publishing, and the content of the novels themselves as an equally monstrous intrusion into the ordinarily innocent minds of young readers. The question I want to take up here in the remainder of our time is why such monstrous intrusions, viewed as unwelcome trespassers by many adults, are often welcomed by many young readers as invited guests. Now, the knee-jerk reaction to such elements in children's books can be a simple one. Frightening things scare children into being good. And perhaps this is true. So one example of this kind of book is Struwwelpeter. It's called Pretty Stories and Funny Pictures for Little Children from 1845. And if you've ever read it, it's a good example of such text. So like the little boy up in the top left he has his thumbs cut off because he sucks his thumbs too much. The girl that catches fire with the cats crying over her stands clue close to the fire after her mother has warned her multiple times not to do so. And this is what I was talking about kind of at the beginning of my talk tonight, which with the pedagogy of fear. So I want to hear some of the morals that you came up with for Bluebeard. Is anyone willing to offer one?
Say, don't be so nuts.
Don't be so nosy. Yeah, okay. There's like a saying I think that would go along with that too. Can anyone? This often comes up. Mind your own business. Yeah, so those are along the same lines. Or like curiosity killed the cat. Okay. Did anybody write that down?
Well, I've got
You did?
curiosity kills in unexpected ways.
Oh, I like that too. Okay. But then the question I always ask my students in response to that is, who ends up dead at the end of the story? Bluebeard does, right? Not her. So it's an interesting, it's like complex, right? That you know, we might expect in a story that had the moral of curiosity killed the cat, that the girl would be the one dead at the end of the story. So her curiosity actually, in some ways, enables her to discover the truth about her husband, that he is a serial killer and that she needs to find a way out of the situation that she's found herself in.
There's another line that runs through a lot of these stories. Some girl inevitably messes up and some man rescues her.
Yes. And a lot of the more popular ones for sure too. Like the versions of Grimm's fairy tales I brought with me tonight. You know, this has the majority of the Grimm's fairy tales in here. There are hundreds of them, right? But if we look on the shelves of the libraries, not libraries necessarily, but bookstores, they give you very short versions of the Grimms, right? So they'll give you like 15 stories. Tell me some of the ones that you know that are the most popular. That, like, if I tell you fairy tales, what words pop into your mind? What titles?
Cinderella.
Cinderella, good. Which is one of the most gruesome fairy tales, actually. Do you know why?
Because the mother usually actually killed her first stepmother.
Well, so the mother ends up dead, right? And then we have the stepmother. The stepmother, in order to have her daughter's feet fit into the shoes, she cuts their feet, right? And then the punishment at the end of the tale is the stepsisters have their eyes pecked out by birds. Now, we don't see that anymore, though, because these tales have been really sanitized, right? So the versions that like I have two kids now, 17 and I don't even know how old, this is bad, 17 and 11, I think. But I read them a lot of like the newer versions of these. And they strip out a lot of these violent moments, like they strip out the punishment that the Grimms kept in. And one thing that I should note too is that the Grimms took stories that were intended for adults and they cast them for children. But they did not take these violent moments out. In some instances, they actually amplified them. What they did take out was sex. So any references to sex, for example, older versions of Red Riding Hood are very much targeted toward like teaching young girls to pay attention to their surroundings and who they might run into in the woods. That innuendo is there in the Little Red Riding Hood versions that we read today, but it's not as strongly present. Okay, let's come back to Bluebeard though.
Could I inject?
Yeah.
One of the problems storytellers found out is they tell basically the tame, sanitized version to the kids, and they're like, that's not how it goes.
Right.
Because they've seen the Disney movie.
One of the books.
Disney movie is how it goes.
One of the books too that, or kids will say, like, you're leaving out important moments that I already know about if a storyteller tries to, like, if they've had access to the older versions of the tales. So one of the books that I was going to talk about tonight that is a newer fairy tale is called A Tale Dark and Grim. And what this writer did was he took Hansel and Gretel and he imagined them as like different characters who move throughout every single, not every single, but like a lot of the fairy tales that you would know. And he has a storyteller in the book as the main voice. And then the children like object to the storyteller telling the story the wrong way, which I'm sure never happened to you before. Okay, but there's another moral, I think, in Bluebeard that we haven't touched on.
I put down, don't worry about morals because in the end, luck matters more.
Oh, I like that. That wasn't what I was thinking of, but I like that one a lot. Anyone else want to try?
I put down, you will be rescued when the Uber car arrives.
And
That's a good
why.
one too. One that often comes up whenever I teach this story is the moral that like you shouldn't marry for money, that you should marry for love. So like one of the objections that comes up to this story is that like she got herself into trouble because she married for money rather
She
than.
ended up with one.
Yeah. So, I mean, long story short, a lot of the older fairy tales that we know that have violence in them operate by a method of a pedagogy of fear. Now, a lot of the newer ones that have been written in more recent years, I'm going to jump back a few slides, operate more on a pedagogy of choice. So one of the ones that I'm going to talk about is Coraline. Has anyone ever seen the film or read the book? No? Okay. So in these ones, what really lies at the heart of them is what I've come to call the defeat of the Jabberwock. And that's like what I have up on the slide here behind me. And this is the idea that the child reader like leaps into the book to behead the monster and vicariously experiences its defeat through their reading. In the reader's imagination, you know, they slay the beast and go galumping back to reality with the dragon's head. In these types of books, the horrific rarely triumphs, as also in Bluebeard. And the child, in confronting it, is pressed further on their journey toward a more experienced, savvy personhood. As Adam Gidwitz writes in his revision of Grimm's Fairy Tales, A Tale Dark and Grimm, which I just had up on the slide, quote, I love this quote, to find the brightest wisdom, one must pass through the darkest zones, and through the darkest zones there can be no guide that is but courage. Okay, I'm nearing the end of my talk here. So since I started with it, I want to take up Coraline again as an example of a modern fairy tale. The book became exceedingly popular with American children after the release of the film version of the novel in 2009. And in his epigraph to the text, and an epigraph is like a quote that an author will put at the beginning of a novel to kind of give you a sense of what's to come, okay? And the quote that Neil Gaiman foregrounds in this is from G.K. Chesterton, and it reads, fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. After reading Chesterton's quote, we enter Coraline's world expecting two things. One, that Coraline is designed to read as a modern fairy tale, and two, that by the end of the novel, the petrifying beings Coraline will confront will be defeated. Now, Coraline is really like an updated Alice in Wonderland story, blended with the old fairy tales Hansel and Gretel and Bluebeard. The door features very heavily in here. So this is like, the story is that this girl moves into a new apartment and her mother is very busy and she doesn't have time for Coraline. So she tells Coraline, here's a set of keys, go around and see which doors they open, count the windows, right? We're back to Bluebeard. Count the windows, see how many windows there are, how many doors. You know, it's like a mother's tactic to keep her child busy, right? Many of us in this room have probably used that tactic, or parents. Coraline discovers, though, and you can see it in the slide here, a little door. It's covered over, and there's a key that goes to it, but she can't get it to open. Well, she wakes up in the middle of the night, and there are these little mice running around, and then she runs out, and she sees that the door is open to the other side of, it's called the other world, okay? And in the other world, there is, this is the passageway. On the right, this is the doppelganger of her mother. Now, you'll notice something weird about her if you look very closely. You might not be able to see it from where you're sitting. Can you see what she has for eyes? They're buttons. Yes, they are buttons. So this mother has everything that Coraline wants. She pays attention to Coraline. She cooks her good food. You know, it's like a spectacle every night. There's a performance and entertainment. She has a bedroom full of all of the toys that she would ever want. But there's a deal, okay, that she has to make. The deal is that she gives the mother, the other mother, she's called in the book, her eyes. Right. And would have the eyes replaced by buttons. Now, that's important because if you think about eyes as a symbol in literature or in the world, have you ever heard sayings about eyes? Like your eyes are the window to the soul, right? So it's like a selling of the soul. Now, as the book progresses, the mother, you understand, is play acting. By the end of the film version, she looks like that on the left. And she's like a spider. She has spider webs all over the place. And so Coraline discovers very quickly that she's gotten herself into a trap. Now, I don't want to ruin the book for you if you're going to go and read it from here. But Neil Gaiman, the author, argued that this book is a fairy tale like Hansel and Gretel is a fairy tale. Now, let's talk a little bit about Hansel and Gretel. What does anyone remember the plot of the story, Hansel and Gretel?
Send them out, the boys' parents send them out, the boys to stay there.
Okay, let's pause there. Why did they send them out?
Their mother couldn't feed them.
Yeah, their mother can feed them. It's famine, right? So there's famine running amok. So they take them out into the woods. Keep going.
Leave them there and rent them. The witch finds them. They take back to the witch's house and try to throw them in the oven.
Well, let's pause there too. What does the witch's house look like?
Well, like goodies. It was in the kitty version, it's cookies and cake.
Oh yeah, right.
But in the other one, it was just, it made it look like a regular house, but they found out they could eat the walls.
Right. Right. I mean, so this is, you know, these kids are suffering from famine. Their family has been suffering from famine. They are enticed into the witch's home because it either looks like gingerbread, cookies, cake, etc., or they are welcomed in with loving arms and given a warm bed and a place to eat after being left in the woods by their parents. Eventually, the children win, right? They are victorious because they, what do? Yes, yes. He puts the stick out and he says it's his finger, and so she's trying to fatten him up, the witch, and he puts his keeps putting a stick out and saying it's his finger so that he hasn't gained any weight. But they push the witch into the oven, right? So I mean, there's all this food imagery that's present in Hansel and Gretel, and that's really, I think, telling too, because a lot of the things that are violent symbolically in these tales are connected to the world in which the children are operating. So it's like in Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? There's this fear of like the destruction of the English Empire. And so the vampire is coming from the East and invading London, if you've ever read that book. You know, zombie movies were super popular in the 80s as like malls are coming to be, and capitalism is, you know, a really important part of American society. And this idea of like people just devouring whatever. So like the point I'm trying to make is that monsters are often deeply connected to what people are afraid of in this society in general. Just as in Hansel and Gretel, like a lot of the fear that comes out of that text is rooted in hunger. I skipped around a little bit, but the one thing that I want to say at the end of this talk, and then I'm going to take questions, I promise, is that Coraline is really rooted in identity. So like she's trying to discover who she is. And it's also rooted in her acceptance of her identity, of her mother as, you know, her mother may be flawed, but she's her mother and she's not trying to take her eyes. So it's like a resignation to this is my place in the world, but she also is very brave and very smart in the way that she's able to get back into her own world and close the door to Bluebeard's world, to the other world where she might have lost her life or lost her soul. So I think that's like an important new direction for like more modern fairy tales that people are telling for children now. It's not just like a pedagogy of fear to get children to kind of act the way that people want them to, but a pedagogy of choice that's designed to help children make the brave and the right choice by the end of the reading of the novel. I will say, and I had this as a kind of end of my talk, like sometimes I wonder reading these books, which are sometimes violent at their core. The first time that I read Coraline, my daughter was obsessed with the movie, my older daughter. And so I decided to read the book to her aloud while she was like laying down for a nap. And then I thought, well, this was a bad decision. Because the book is really, really scary. It's not very long. It's like 100 and some pages. So if you wanted to pick it up, and it's designed for tweens. I would say it's like a 10 to 12 age, 10 to 13 book. But sometimes I wonder, like, in a world where violence may be a very real danger for children that they must confront, I do sometimes wonder and worry about the value of violence in children's literature. And many publishers and authors, it seems, experience similar angst given the sanitized versions of the Grimm's tales that I was talking about that find themselves on the shelves of today's bookstores. I've really come to the conclusion, though, over the years of my studies, that stripping such stories of their violence and strangeness and scariness can strip them of a lot of their complexity, of the raiments that made them so compelling in the first place. Dragons do exist, and children must learn how to beat them somewhere. Why not in the pages of a book? So, questions. I saw a hand in the back. Go ahead.
So I'm wondering, what is the symbolism in the Grimm's tales, as well as many of the others, of the issues with the parents?
Yeah.
People stepmom, the parents aren't even there, the parents leave them in the woods. I mean,
Right.
I mean, all of this, there are constantly, and so at that time, the time that these were written, there was the cohesive family, the idea of that. So I'm confused as to what the message is.
That is a great question.
Yeah, why is there always a stepmom?
A stepmom, yeah. Well, in some of the older versions of the Hansel and Gretel, it's the mother. Or not,
Regardless. I mean,
yeah. So the Grimms felt a little bit uncomfortable about it being the mother, so they made them evil stepmothers sometimes. And scholars like Bruno Bettelheim, who've written a lot about fairy tales and like the meaning and importance of fairy tales for children, have argued that the stepmother is actually a symbol for like the bad mother. So it's like a mother having two sides, right? Like a loving side as a parent, and then a side that the child is afraid of because of some of the actions of the mother. So it's like splitting one person into two different personalities. But I think also two other responses to your question. In the time of Hansel and Gretel, abandonment would have been a real fear. And having to learn to deal with a stepmother, a step parent would have also had to have been a real fear because many women died in childbirth. So their children then had to learn to navigate new families. But I think too, you know, a lot of children's most dramatic and difficult experiences are probably sometimes learning to deal with their parents, you know, like learning how to interact with their parents or seeing their parents as people. So I think it makes sense that the drama with the parents is often at the core of the stories. It's still there. Like if you read Harry Potter, for example, the disappearance of his parents is actually the driving force for much of the novel. And in a lot of these kinds of stories, it's the disappearance of the parents that pushes the child into adulthood. Like they then actually in Coraline, the other mother steals her real parents and takes them into the other world, and she has to figure out how to get them back. I don't know if I've answered your question well, but
Another thing I noticed, you never see the father. You never speak.
they are often very absent. Yeah. So like in Cinderella, for example, the father in that story is very absent. Sometimes they're very present though, like in a story like The Girl Without Hands, for example, the father makes a deal with the devil, and then the deal is that his daughter's hands have to be cut off. in order to gain wealth and stuff like that. So, I mean, these are versions that, again, that you're going to find in more modern collections of the Grimms. But if you go in and read a lot of the older ones, you'll find hundreds of stories like that. I saw your hand.
Were fathers maybe just generally more absent back then in general, so it was just more normal what to happen part of the story? I don't know, or
Yeah.
I'm completely wrong, just maybe in general, the mom is more.
Right. Yeah. Like the father would be, it's like the separate spheres model, right? Like the father was more in control of what happened in the outside world, outside of the home, and the mother was more in control of the domestic space, the home itself. So I think that's also why it's often mothers that are like under fire in fairy tales, because they were the ones who were interacting with the children the most. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
What about the Wizard of Oz?
Oh,
I hated it.
you didn't like it. Can you tell me why? I wouldn't classify it as a.
I had a reoccurring dream after that.
Oh,
And I never told anyone. That witch was flying in the air and
Yeah.
she had a bag on the back of her roasting. And I would watch her and she'd land in front of me and she'd open the bag and it was me in pieces melted.
wow. That is quite a nightmare.
Yes. I never liked it. I still don't like gory movies and stuff.
And stuff like that, yeah.
No, it's
Yeah.
not fun.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true for
I messed
children
up
too.
that
Like,
day.
I think some kids, like my two kids, for example, I have one kid that loves everything scary, and I have another kid that like she's gonna run in the opposite direction as fast as she can. So I think sometimes it's just like your predilection for it. I know that I came to be really interested in it, and this is the way that I opened my book. Actually, my mom used to read to me from Poe when I was young. And so, like, I had this sleepover. I think I was 7 years old, and my mom's like, "Okay, everybody, get your sleeping bags together." And she read to us The Telltale Heart. You know, but I think that speaks to like our interest is in, you know, as humans in these like very scary experiences. There's something like exhilarating about them. So often, you know, back in like Charles Dickens' era, for example, the reason that A Christmas Carol came to be was because Gothic and horror stories were really popular to read on Christmas Eve. People loved them. They would buy like new collections of them. So he was like, this is a good way to make money.
Now, think about it. You know, you grew up on the Mother Goose books and stuff. Like, you feel
Yeah.
like Three Little Pigs.
Yeah.
The moral of that story was how you built
Your
a
house.
house, the strength. But that Hansel and Gretel, I always said, well, that should have been scary anyway. I said, you know, we left this out here as a child of man.
Yeah.
And then you get the witch, and now she's talking about eating us. And so, you know, like, okay, that's a little scary, but then I understood that they should have never went in the house.
Yeah.
But like you
Yeah.
said, in the original one, it's famine.
Well, one thing we didn't talk about too, and this is back to the hunger and consumption fear, but a lot of the scariness in some of these tales comes out of like a cannibalistic urge on the witch's part, for instance, in Hansel and Gretel. But if you think about that symbolically too, it's this idea that you're like consumed by the forces that surround you that you don't necessarily have a lot of control over, like being left in the woods. So it's not necessarily, you know, I mean, think of when you leave here tonight, think in your mind, like all these stories where it's like, I'll gobble you up, right? My dad used to tell me, what was the story at the end of, I can't think. It wasn't the Three Little Bears, it was something else. Or Goldilocks, it wasn't Goldilocks. But like, he would always be like, and I'll gobble you up at the end of the story. But it's like it's a technique that's used often because it's like a real fear, I think, of children of being like consumed by forces that you don't have any power over. I know we're nearing the end of our time, but I'm willing to answer a few more questions.
One of the you pointed out that in your slides there the story about Struwell plate.
Oh yeah, I'll go back to it.
And that's the book itself is from I guess it's from Germany or.
That's right,
Switzerland,
yeah.
because my wife is Swiss and she had a copy.
You had a copy.
I grew up with it.
Okay. I love that. Did you like it?
After that one story, I never.
You never
sucked
opened
my
it
thumb
again.
again.
It terrified you. It did its job so well. It terrified you so
Oh
well.
my goodness.
But that's the thing, they'll teach your kids to behave well, but if you take it to the extreme,
Too far.
they become a little obsessive compulsive.
Right. Well, and some people have argued that it's like, it actually goes so far that it's funny. You know what I mean? Like that the book goes so far that it actually makes kids laugh rather than. Yeah. Yeah. So it's one of those books that like kind of revels in this like high level of violence. But yeah, it comes out of the same tradition as the Grimms generally, a little bit later, but.
But also good behavior. The Germans have all these good characters in their books that you don't see too much in the English version, like Max and Moritz. Those two kids that get sort of, they're always doing something bad. They
get away with it. I'm not familiar with it. They don't get away with it either.
They get ground up by the miller and
Right.
eaten by the ducks.
Yeah. There we are again with that same theme. Anybody else? Well, I've really enjoyed my time with you tonight. I hope you've learned something and found it interesting. I loved hearing your version of the story, so thank you. Yeah, you can find me on Point Park's website if you're ever interested. And, my email is there too, so if you want to reach out with any questions after our sessions.
Where can you get the original Grimms?
They were, I got this one actually at like, not Borders, Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble?
Yeah, this is one of the, like Barnes and Noble has these classic editions where they're like the illustrated covers and stuff like that. And I like this one, although it doesn't have a lot of illustrations on the inside. It has some cat, but yeah, you can get these pretty much anywhere. I would get like the fuller version if you're interested in reading. I actually did a project where I read one a day for a long time, and they're very short. They're usually like 3 to 5 pages. So, your hand.
Four-line being geared towards teen.
Do the reader paper at all?
Oh yeah, I love it. I love Neil Gaiman's work, honestly. So that book, and then another book that's called The Graveyard Book. His writing is phenomenal. I highly recommend it.
You talk about Goosebumps, and I based it on Saturday mornings.
Yeah.
It's the series.
Yeah.
And I used to watch that.
You liked it?
I liked it.
My brother loved that show. He watched it all the time.
And my kids took a test and watched it.
Yeah, no.
Little boys, so they can.
Yeah, my brother loved that show for some reason. Yeah. Well, thank you. Bye. Grab some cookies and pop and stuff. Take care.